You have one? Got one? You got two? You got enough. I don't have one. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. We have some seats open in the front for those who aren't too shy. It is my pleasure to welcome Reverend Nathan Empsall to Grace. He was a couple years ahead of me at Yale Divinity School. Nathan has a BA in Government and Native American Studies, Master of Divinity from YDS, and he did a dual degree program. The Smart Kids did that, also earning a Master of Environmental Management. He has professional experience in public policy and at the United Nations. After graduating from Divinity School, he was the Executive Director of Faithful America, organizing 200,000 members primarily in digital Christian campaigns against white Christian nationalism and for social justice. In addition to specific goal-oriented campaigns, he also offered trainings against white Christian nationalism and clergy protests against it, like events where Michael Flynn and Franklin Graham were touring. He's written for NBC News, Time, Newsweek, The Hill, what's RNS, Religion News Service, and more. He is currently the priest in charge at St. PJ's in New Haven, where their motto is Jazz, Justice, and Jesus. You can ask him for details on that. They have a whole jazz service. So if you have talents in that field and would like to start one here, let me know. I give you Reverend Nathan Empsall.
Thank you, Misty, and thank you, Grace. I've really never been to Maine. I've taken 2 trips where I've been in the far north of New Hampshire, up the Canadian border, and driven across the Maine border, gotten out of the car, put my feet on the ground, said, I'm in Maine, and drove back to New Hampshire. So to be here for 4 or 5 days here in Bath and in Portland is way overdue. Thank you. This morning's talk, I've given it a couple different names. I think, I said to Misty, it's God's Microphones, Christian Saints and Preachers Against Authoritarianism. The title I put on your handout, which has pictures and quotes from the people we'll be talking about, is Christian Saints Against Tyranny and Fascism. The words aren't exactly interchangeable, but they're close. But we call it God's Microphones. And that comes from a quote from Oscar Romero, Saint Oscar. Each one of you has to be God's microphone. Each one of you has to be a messenger, a prophet. Wherever there is someone who has been baptized, that is where the church is. There is a prophet there. What is authoritarianism? What is tyranny? I'm not going to talk about why they matter right now. I'll let you figure that out. But authoritarianism is any centralized power, government power, where there's no democracy, limited pluralism, and limited civil liberties, with little to no room for the individual to speak out. I think what really matters is that under authoritarianism, and certainly under the broader umbrella of tyranny, the state systematically denies life and liberty, God-given liberty. Authoritarianism includes any number of different specific forms. It can take left-wing and right-wing fashions. There's fascism, There's state communism. There's totalitarianism, where the government has total control of every aspect of your life. Any dictatorship really falls under some form of these banners. And so when we talk about authoritarianism and tyranny, this conversation today will take us through Imperial Rome, American slavery, Latin America, the Third Reich, and Cambodia. What is this not? This is specifically, my talk is specifically about Christians who had resistance to state injustice rooted in their faith. This is not a talk about being pro-justice or progressive.
I'm going to raise your microphone.
Oh, okay, sorry, I can bring it closer too. All right, is that better? Oh, I can hear the difference.
Yeah.
All right, sorry about that. So we will talk about those Christians who offered faith-based resistance to state injustice. Now, that's not the same as talking about those who were pro-justice or progressive. That's very important, but that's a different talk. I'm not talking about Dorothy Day or the Berrigan brothers, etc. today. I'm going to focus only on non-violent figures, no John Brown. And I'm going to keep this talk focused on Christians. I certainly acknowledge and deeply respect that there are other faith-based resistance movements. I honor them. I want to learn from them. I'm all about Jesus. That's my message. Some of the names we'll talk about are martyrs, some are not, but all risked martyrdom, not just in defense of their faith, as the church usually defines martyrdom, but also in defense of others, in defense of the oppressed, because of their faith. We'll look at brief bios of bishops, priests, theologians, and lay people, with an emphasis on how each person was formed by faith and then acted out of faith. And then we'll have a brief closing discussion of the patterns that emerge across these stories. This talk is political, like Jesus, but it is not partisan. The saints we're looking at stood against corrupt and harmful rulers. So did the prophets of the Bible. David against Saul, Nathan against David, all the later Old Testament prophets to later Hebrew kings, John the Baptist against Herod, Jesus flipping tables, calling himself the Son of Man, his mother, Mary, proclaiming that God will tear down the mighty from their thrones and lift up the lowly. So with this political Bible, not partisan, but political in mind, we ask, who followed that example? The example of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ, who rooted themselves in the Christian faith to stand against oppression, juxtaposing, to quote Jesus, the power of love with the love of power. How'd they do it? What formed them? And what can we learn from them today? I will try to keep this to an hour. If I run to the full hour and you need to leave, I understand. I'd be happy to run 15 minutes over for those who want to stay with questions, answers, and better yet, insights and comments. And please, if you have questions of clarity, if you don't understand me, if something doesn't make sense, ask those as we go along. I don't want you to misunderstand everything I say because you missed the starting block. But discussions and other content questions, we can save those till the end. So I'm going to start. So your handout doesn't have facts. It's not like a PowerPoint, but it has pictures of the people I'm talking about and quotes from most of them. And I'm going to start in Imperial Rome, not usually where we think of. I think the mind goes to World War II when we think about and Bonhoeffer and the like. But we'll start with St. Ambrose. And in seminary, I'd never heard of Ambrose before. And the small details of his biography really grabbed me in ancient theology class. Ambrose was the bishop of Milan, Italy, from 374 to 397. So he's the bishop in far north Italy when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380. Examples of his faith. Ambrose was one of the first, and this is what they usually teach you about Ambrose. Ambrose was one of the first 4 doctors of the church. Just 37 Catholic saints, 34 of whom are from before 1600, who made significant contributions to theology or doctrine. Ambrose is one of the first 4. He's the guy who basically defines Nicene theology, the Nicene Creed, the idea of the Trinity as central to Christianity. And more than that, he's the one who leads the way in fighting off the Arianist heresy. Arius was basically saying Jesus is not divine. and that was catching on. And it was the biggest heresy of the earlier church. And Ambrose is the guy who defines Christianity as Trinity and divine Jesus. He's also the guy who converts and baptizes St. Augustine. So in other words, he's one of the guys. He's also noted for his deep spirituality and for writing many hymns, some of which survive to this day. There are a couple in the hymnal 1982. I'd never heard of them, they're minor ones, but they're still there 1,600 years later. He was very popular as a bishop, due in part to his good preaching, but mostly to his solidarity with the poor. As bishop, he'd been governor before he was bishop, but then he becomes the bishop, and he sells all of his land that he'd inherited, that he had as governor, gives up all that political power, sells the land, gives all his money to the poor, much like St. Francis. He preached, if you have 2 shirts in your closet, one belongs to you and the other to the man with no shirt. And he was known, it wasn't just charity, it was public policy. He pushed the Roman court to stop abusing the poor and take better care of the wealthy. That's what they teach you about Ambrose, and that's usually where it stops. But there are some details that were mentioned in passing, and I dug into them and said, why is this not in the main biography of the man? 3 times he really stood up to imperial authoritarianism, 4 if you count the fighting against poverty that I just mentioned. 2 of them were very similar. Twice, in 385 and 386, the child emperor Valentinian II and his regent mother, the real power, Justina, demanded that Ambrose give up 2 of his churches in Milan to the Arians, to the heretical sect of Christianity. Justina was a member. She really liked Arius and followed his teachings. A modern equivalent would be like this Donald Trump ordering the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, Mary Ann Buddy, to give the National Cathedral over to Franklin Graham or Paula White King. That's functionally what happened. But Ambrose refused, and he declared what belongs to God is outside the emperor's power. And he barred the church doors. Well, court officers came, and they hung imperial signs on the church, and they sent soldiers to seize the church from Ambrose. But remember I mentioned he was popular because of his preaching and his love for the poor? The soldiers came in, and they sided with Ambrose, and they tore down their emperor's signs. The emperor relented. He said, soon you're going to be bringing me to Ambrose in chains. This happened twice. Then again, in 390, the next emperor, Theodosius, he was actually on Ambrose's side. He's a Nicene Christian, not an Arian. Yet Ambrose threatened him with excommunication. There was a major massacre, which the emperor had actually tried to stop, but his orders were too late. And Roman soldiers killed hundreds of civilians at Thessalonica in Greece. And Ambrose said, this is evil, and you will publicly apologize. You will publicly repent to God. You will make this right. I mean, he could have really pushed the emperor away here and lost a valuable ally, but instead he used his relationship with the emperor instead of trying to protect his access to power. And it worked, and that's the picture in your handout. I found 3 or 4 different classical paintings of the emperor Theodosius repenting at the church door before Bishop Ambrose. This was the earliest of the paintings that I could find. And I do want to offer a cautionary note. Ambrose was somewhat anti-Semitic. I would spend more time on that note and discuss his anti-Semitism if we had more time, but I think it's a problematic side that should at least be mentioned. All of the figures we are going to discuss have their issues, and we shouldn't overlook them and pretend that these people are perfect. The next name of 7 or so names, I may have to cut 1 or 2 as I watch the clock, but the next name on the list is Harriet Tubman. I don't think I need to say show of hands who's heard of Harriet Tubman. Given her pre-existing fame and our time limits, I'll only note a couple quick things about her. After escaping slavery in Maryland in 1849, Tubman became one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad, returning home a whopping 13 times to lead 70 other enslaved people to freedom, and then another 700 from South Carolina during the Civil War as a Union spy. I didn't know this until I was preparing this talk at my church last year. After the war, she became a suffragette, working with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for women's voting rights. Everything Harriet Tubman did was because of her Christian faith. As a child, she turned to religion to cope with brutality and oppression and beatings and head trauma and family separation as her siblings were sold. Her favorite Bible story was that of Moses, who led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt. She always, throughout her life, said that her struggle against slavery had been commanded by God. She also spoke against the blasphemy of slave owner religion that attempted to justify chattel slavery, and she prayed for slave owners to convert to true Christianity. Tubman's was a risky struggle, truly an example of taking up one's cross. All of her trips were back to her home region where she could be recognized. Moreover, she suffered from childhood-based traumatic brain injury, a head wound, and frequently fainted, including during her missions. Immense danger here. No one would have blamed her if she went a different way, but she says God didn't let her. It's a remarkable story of faith. I also include Tubman not just for her faith, but to challenge the way we think of authoritarianism and tyranny. At first glance, for all its problems, the American government does not fit that description. And in the 1850s, we're a democratic republic only 70 years out from the Constitution. We're neither fascist nor communist. Communism hasn't even really been invented yet. But if you were Black, America was totalitarian. The government allowing states and rich white men to have total control of your body and your life. And so it wasn't authoritarianism for everyone, but it was authoritarian, including for Harriet Tubman. Now, having covered Harriet Tubman and St. Ambrose, we'll jump forward in history to more modern regimes. We'll spend a little more time on some of these names. These are now the names that are more likely to come to mind, I think, when we think about dictators and authoritarians. By the way, I found some really cool old pictures of Harriet Tubman that have been colorized, but I just loved this mural so much. It's at the Harriet Tubman Museum in Cambridge, Maryland on the Eastern Shore, and then the picture of the child there. I hadn't seen that before. I love it. Now, on the next page, I keep this icon of Oscar Romero in my office. Priests shouldn't have favorite parishioners. Parents shouldn't have favorite children. But I do have favorite saints. I've got St. Francis, I've got Mary Mother of God, I've got St. Nicholas, and I've got my boy St. Oscar. Oscar Romero was the Archbishop of San Salvador. Some of you may remember from when he was still in the news, may remember the headlines of some of what I'm going to talk about, fairly recent. 1970s, weren't that long ago. He was only Archbishop in the capital of El Salvador, a Catholic Archbishop, for 3 years, from February 3rd, 1977, until his assassination on March 24th, 1980. He's known for two things. He's known for siding with the poor, particularly farm workers, time and time again. And he's known for publicly denouncing his government's death squads, internationally as well as domestically. On March 23rd, 1980, St. Oscar delivered a widely heard radio address urging Catholic soldiers not to obey immoral orders, not illegal orders, immoral orders, legal or not. He urged them not to kill their fellow countrymen. He was murdered by a government death squad the very next evening. Now, I want to correct the record about St. Oscar. There's a story that's told quite frequently, but it's fictional. Well, a little incorrect. The story I think that we often hear about Oscar Romero is that he was a conservative priest who became a conservative junior bishop, always opposed to liberation theologians and activist Jesuits. True so far. He was selected to become archbishop by the Pope's nuncio, which is the Pope's ambassador or representative in a country to both its bishops and the government. And he was selected to be archbishop because of his conservatism and because he was seen as someone who would be quiet and manageable. Again, all true. But here the story continues that St. Oscar was only radicalized a month after he became archbishop because his friend, the Jesuit priest Rutilio Grande, was killed by government security forces on March 12th, 1977. And this always bothered me. So many people in privilege only speak out when their own people are finally threatened. We'll quote the Niemöller prayer later. First they came forth. Was Romero another such story, only speaking out once the Catholic Church itself was being threatened? That's the story we read even in the Episcopal Church's biography, in Lesser Feasts and Fasts of Romero. The answer is no. I was very grateful to learn as I prepared this series, which is a 5-part series I'm trying hard to make into 1 hour. I was very grateful to learn that Romero's story is a little more complicated than that. It's true that he spoke out publicly the loudest after Blessed Rutilio was killed. But that assassination of his friend was not a road to Damascus conversion moment, as the biopic portrays. It was a catalyzing moment, but it's the moment that brought St. Oscar's new self public, not the moment that created this new self. Romero had already been going through a long process as a rural bishop in Santiago de Maria, where he spent time with poor farm workers and saw how the government kept them poor and brutally murdered them. There was one point where the National Guard massacred farm workers. And Bishop Romero went to pray with their families and saw their bodies still on the streets. And he wrote his opposition to the president, privately, but wrote it. And then he went to meet, again, still privately, but he went to meet with the National Guard commander in his office. And the Guard commander dismissed the massacre as a trivial thing, and then menacingly told St. Oscar, cassocks aren't bulletproof. That did not scare off the bishop. His newfound advocacy on behalf of farm workers continued. He held public policy conferences at the cathedral exploring land reform that the government wouldn't like. He let the poor sleep in the church with their children, bigger and bigger acts that somehow those in El Salvador missed, in San Salvador. So when he returns to San Salvador as the archbishop, the local priests were concerned. They remembered the conservative ways he had from his previous time with them. They welcomed him after learning of his new views on poverty. He explained to some of the Jesuits, I spent years and years absorbed in my books, and I started to forget the poverty I came from. Then they sent me to Santiago de Maria, and I ran into extreme poverty again. Those children that were dying just because of the water they were drinking. Those campesinos, farm workers, killing themselves in the harvests. So yes, I changed, but I also came back home again. It was Archbishop. It's not St. Rutilio's death that's on his mind, it's the farm workers, as he speaks out against the government's death squads. He speaks out against martyred priests and bombed churches, yes. He talks about this at international engagements. But he also points out, I've noticed it's not the whole church that gets bombed. It's not every priest who gets killed. It's only those who speak for the poor. The government leaves the rest of the priests alone. He wrote to President Carter. He wrote to Pope John Paul II, asking them to speak out. He had the most popular radio program in the country. 73% of the rural population and over 40% of the urban population listened to St. Oscar every Saturday and Sunday on the radio. It's shocking to think about that now with cable and the internet. Nothing has that reach. But that would have scared the government that someone had that much reach. Every Saturday, he broadcast a list of the latest killed, tortured, or disappeared. And then every Sunday, he broadcast his sermon. On Sunday, March 23rd, 1980, in his sermon broadcast, he spoke directly to soldiers. God's law must prevail. Thou shalt not kill. No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. It is time to obey your consciences rather than the orders of sin. In the name of God, therefore, and in the name of this suffering people whose cries rise to heaven more loudly each day, I beg you, I beseech you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression. I wonder how the president felt about that radio broadcast. Next morning, Monday, the newspaper quoted an army spokesman calling it treason. Hours later, Monday evening, Romero was celebrating Mass in a hospital chapel. He finished his sermon by using Christ's suffering as a call to work for peace and justice in our own time. He walked from the pulpit to the altar, and as he did so, a government-backed assassin burst into the back of the church and shot him in the heart, and he slumped down dead on the altar itself. 250,000 people attended his funeral, which was rightly seen as a protest by both the mourners and the government. And as a result, 31 people were murdered at his funeral. And yet the mourners kept lining up to see his body anyway. And he was finally made a saint about 15 years ago. He's my favorite. But we moved to Dietrich Bonhoeffer in World War II. Obviously, we couldn't do today without talking about every American's favorite German theological spy. How many of you heard of Bonhoeffer?
We did all parachute.
Oh, you did? You told me that. Perfect. All right. Sometimes I do this talk, everyone knows Bonhoeffer eminently well. Sometimes they say, I've heard of him, but I've heard his name 1,000 times. I don't know anything. I confess a personal connection. Bonhoeffer's execution was on April 9th, 1945. Thus, his feast day in both the Catholic and Episcopal churches is April 9th, my birthday. Bonhoeffer was born in 1906, German theologian, Lutheran theologian, pastor, and director of a seminary associated with the anti-Hitler confessing church. He wrote extensively on grace, ethics, and caring for others. He was executed in prison for speaking against Hitler's regime. Of special note, if I could only say one thing about Bonhoeffer, it's this. Most confessing church leaders, we really look up to and respect the confessing church now. And I've heard so many people since 2016 say, we need a new Barmen Declaration, the confessing church's declaration against Hitler's takeover of the church. But many confessing church members, while standing up to Hitler's authoritarian power, still shared not only his extreme German nationalism, but also his anti-Semitism. What set Bonhoeffer apart was that he explicitly said, when few other, even anti-Hitler Germans did, that support for imperiled Jews wasn't just important, but of paramount importance, over and above defending the church itself. Now, there's a fight for Bonhoeffer's legacy today. It seems that all U.S. Protestants, evangelical and mainline, liberal and conservative alike, everyone seems to love him, but different factions claim different parts of his life and legacy. Some see Bonhoeffer as a theological giant of grace and social justice, others as a pacifist turned spy who ultimately supported killing Hitler. There's truth in both descriptions, but despite later myths, his role as a spy was not to plan assassination attempts, but simply to contact Allied friends he'd made during his earlier travels, high-ranking allies like a future Archbishop of Canterbury, and let them know that an active German resistance existed. Let them know that they had friends in the country they could work with during and after the war. That's a pretty minor role in the resistance. So to really understand the link between his faith and his opposition to the Nazis, it's better to look at his profound theologies of caring for one another in Christ-like ways and at his public prophetic voice. He was initially a very academic figure. By the age of 24, 1930, he'd earned 2 doctorates. I got 2 masters in my early 30s, and that's it. This guy's got 2 doctorates at 24. Also, it's at 24 that he becomes a Christian in belief. He'd been a cultural Christian, but fairly atheistic. It was through his work diving into religion academically that he really came to faith. But even when he finds Jesus, he still identifies as a German first, because that is how God made me, and a Christian only second, country above God. But in 1930, he moves to New York City to study at Union Theological Seminary, and he hates it. He is appalled by the unchristian approach of the white church to Black Americans. But then he joins the Black church. He finds the Black church tradition at Abyssinian Baptist in Harlem. There he finds Christ and actual Christ followers. And now Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, not German nationalism, finally become his priorities through the poor, through the racial experience. He goes home. On January 30th, 1933, Germany gets a new chancellor, a chancellor who assumes dictator-like powers and severely cracks down on Jews. Bonhoeffer immediately speaks out, if not against Hitler per se, against the Führer principle of leadership, of authoritarianism, the idea that the chancellor should have all this power. And he speaks out against the associated anti-Semitism almost immediately. That year, the Nazis tried to merge 28 Protestant churches into one state-controlled church. Most Protestant pastors happily went along with it, swept up in a wave of German Christian nationalism. Not Bonhoeffer. He creates the Pastors' Emergency League to organize opposition to both the Nazification of the church and its associated anti-Semitism. He also, the next year, signs that Barmen Declaration I'd mentioned, Karl Barth and many other confessing church leaders speaking out theologically, quoting scripture against the Third Reich's church takeover. But even though he signs it, he's skeptical. He really wishes it addressed Jewish persecution. It didn't. I've read the declaration a few times. It's one of those things that seems powerful, and then you say, wait a minute, what's not here? In 1936, Bonhoeffer is declared a pacifist and enemy of the state. He faces escalating penalties over the years, such as bans on teaching and publishing. And he ignores them. He listens to God, not Adolf, and his teaching goes underground. It's at this time that he publishes books like The Cost of Discipleship. What was the all church read? Was it Cost of Discipleship? Oh, fantastic. So you already know the quote that I put on your handout. I wasn't going to read it anyway, but it's the one about cheap grace and costly grace. And I think it's wonderful theology, and you've read it, but it's remarkable to note that he's publishing that in 1938. And that's not a book about the Nazis, but he is speaking about the Nazis, and it is the theology of that book and of life together that is grounding everything he does. He starts with grace, and that leads to the prophetic voice. In 1939, as we noted, he became a spy, leaking information to English contacts. On April 5th, 1943, Bonhoeffer is arrested at his parents' home in Berlin, where he was writing ethics. And on April 9th, 1945, my birthday, he was hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp after having been moved around several prisons, including SS headquarters. Just 3 weeks later, on April 30th, Hitler commits suicide. Just 3 more weeks. That's Bonhoeffer. Any questions? I'm just going at a clip here to get through it all. Any questions of clarification? Has everything I said made sense? You're all with me? Thank you. Wonderful. Or you're so far gone, there's no point asking for clarification. Let's turn from clear leaders with pre-existing platforms. A well-known theologian and friend of Karl Barth, an archbishop. Even if the archbishop was born in poverty, he gets that position, right? These are well-known leaders. Let's turn to ordinary people. Oh, I suppose Harriet Tubman fits that description too. I want to talk about the White Rose. The most well-known members are the brother and sister Hans and Sophie Scholl. How many have heard of the White Rose? A few. I hadn't until I was telling folks at St. PJ's I was going to do this series, and someone said, "You going to include the White Rose?" This was a woman who lived in Germany, Bev. And then a few days later, there are a couple of articles about the White Rose popped up on the National Catholic Review Reporter, which I was reading for work at the time. And then a Facebook friend, one of the canon to Presiding Bishop Curry, randomly posted about the White Rose on Facebook. All of a sudden, it was everywhere when I started putting together this talk. The White Rose is not well known outside of Germany, but it's very well known inside Germany. Monuments, plays, a movie. It's actually kind of the exact opposite of Bonhoeffer. Very well celebrated in the United States, not well known in Germany, but the White Rose is everywhere in Munich. This was a resistance cell of 5 college students and 1 professor at the University of Munich. They were known and ultimately executed for distributing Bible-quoting pamphlets that urged resistance to the Nazis, denounced the murder of Jewish people, and demanded an end to the war. 2 really clear risks here. 1, Munich is the heart of the Nazi party and the Nazi movement. I love Munich. It's cliche, but best sausage I've ever had. Great beer, wonderful people, great street comedians, and also the heart of the Nazi movement. Moreover, these pamphlets were not printed during the rise of Hitler, like what we were saying with so much of Bonhoeffer's work. This was during the war itself. This is 1942 and 1943, and just a few miles down the road from the very first concentration camp, Dachau. Anybody in Munich in 1942 knows exactly what's going on, and Hitler's at the height of his power, and these kids did it anyway. They clandestinely mailed their pamphlets to thousands of families across Germany, as well as distributing them on campus. That much stamps, that much postage, that much paper. No easy feat with rationing. All 6 members of the cell were guided by their Christian faith. 3 Catholics, 2 Lutherans, 1 Eastern Orthodox. And we remember them by listing all of their names. Professor Kurt Huber, Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, Willy Graf, Hans Scholl, and most famously, Sophie Scholl, Hans's 21-year-old sister. The youngest member of the group, Sophie, joined them after her own faith-based journey out of the Hitler Youth and into resistance. Now on campus, this started as a group of friends united by love of art, culture, and philosophy. Together, they met in secret. And this is, when you read about social and cultural resistance to Hitler and the Nazis, all too often, the biggest resistance is ordinary people who just kept meeting, who just kept sharing ideas they were not allowed to share, who listened to jazz records quietly in secret in a basement, but the jazz records were banned. But they kept their own culture and counterculture and ideas alive. And that is how the White Rose starts, just talking about art, culture, and philosophy in secret. But that leads them to discussions of Catholic theology, Catholic social teachings that the Nazis had banned. Professor Huber knew about all, he was a philosophy professor and a folk musician, but he was deeply immersed in Catholic theology. And so these students together focused on Augustine's teachings of grounding oneself in private prayer and cultivating a rich interior spiritual life. And they read John Henry Newman's teachings that every person bears within them the voice of the living God, and that the state cannot quelch that voice. John Henry Newman is regarded as a doctor of the church, the most recent one, a giant Catholic figure. I always think of him as the Anglican priest who left for the Catholics, started the Anglo-Catholic movement in the Anglican and Episcopal churches, then said, never mind, I'm just going over there. I've never really liked him as a result. Feels like a turncoat. But then I read about his influence and his deep theology on the White Rose, and I start to revere the guy too. Now, their pamphlets called on Germans, and in particular Christians, to take clandestine action in ways big and small against the Nazis. Whatever a person could do in their own context. They would write, we can't tell you what to do. You know what's available to you. You know where you stand in your life, what's around you. Do that. They quoted scripture, they quoted Aristotle and Goethe. I'm not going to read any quotes from the handouts, but I've included a couple from their pamphlets, but I've included a couple on your handout should you wish to read them when we're done. In February 1943, Sophie, the 21-year-old, climbs to the top floor of a giant atrium at the University of Munich and joyously throws their 6th leaflet down, and it rains down on students. What a dramatic, impressive, cinematic moment. And the students loved it, but unfortunately a building caretaker witnessed and reported her to the Gestapo. She was arrested, her brother was arrested, ultimately all 6 were arrested and executed that month. Sophie was beheaded at the guillotine at 21 years old. Sophie lost her head, but she did not lose her voice. The White Rose's supporters smuggled the text of that final 6th pamphlet out to the United Kingdom. And later that year, the Royal Air Force blanketed all of Germany with their final pamphlet. And there are many more names from World War II that we could discuss. There are 2 German bishops I love to include. There's a litany of Catholic priests, other pastors who were imprisoned at the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau had a whole priest barracks. And above all, if we had more time, and we're actually doing better on time than I expected, this is great. But if we had more time, I'd want to dive into lay people like Corrie ten Boom, the Dutch Calvinist whose watchmaking family sheltered Jews in the Netherlands. Marianne Haypig, a social worker in Germany, I believe, near Berlin in the suburbs, who had sheltered Jews in her hospital, hiding them as patients. She had access to a prison, so she would smuggle in communion wafers for the monks and smuggle out their memoirs. Social worker, rooted in her faith, doing what she could. Watchmakers, rooted in their faith, doing what they could. But with limited time and the desire to take questions and answers and to hear your thoughts, we'll explore just one more World War II figure, St. Maximilian Kolbe, or Kolbe. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. I read, I don't hear. Kolbe. I'm assuming it's Kolbe.
I've always heard Kolbe.
All right, perfect. St. Maximilian Kolbe. So far, most of the names we've discussed today are known for speaking out and doing so publicly, but there's another form of resistance: basic presence with those who suffer, basic love. Now, certainly Kolbe, a Polish Catholic priest, did speak out. That's what landed him in Auschwitz concentration camp. He used his monastery to shelter 3,000 Polish refugees, including 1,500 Jews. And he published a newspaper that criticized Hitler. But what he is remembered for most, what he became a saint for, is what happened once in Auschwitz, where there could be no speaking out to the rest of the world, but there could still be that pastoral love and presence. Maximilian was banned from acting as a priest, but that didn't stop him from saving scraps of bread and somehow apparently wine to celebrate communion for his fellow imprisoned Catholics. His fellow prisoners after the war said that he always shared his rations with them. After 3 people escaped from Auschwitz, 10 men were chosen for starvation as a communal punishment. One of them was a father and a husband, and Max volunteered to take his place. The shocked guard allowed it. In the bunker where these 10 men were to starve to death, surviving witnesses said that Kolbe stayed calm and led the other 9 men in prayers and hymns for days. They all died. He was the last one left. The Nazis needed the bunker back, so they gave him a lethal injection. St. Kolbe's form of resistance was insistence on providing the sacraments and prayers to those in need, and a holy refusal to deny the dignity of the oppressed, no matter how much the state ordered him to do so. Franciszek Gajdowski, if I'm pronouncing that right, was the man who St. Kolbe took the place of. He survived the war. His sons died, but he was reunited with his wife Helena after the war. He dedicated his life to sharing the story of Father Kolbe, and he was present in 1982 when Pope John Paul II made Kolbe a saint. Now, I could easily go on for another hour. We haven't touched on Idi Amin's Uganda, and there is a saint there I'm looking into for the next round of this. We haven't talked about Pinochet's Chile, Mussolini's fascist Italy, Franco's Spain, or the Soviet Union. But I will at least close with a parallel to Maximilian Kolbe from Pol Pot's Cambodia. Bishop Joseph Salas. Bishop Joseph was one of the first 3 native Cambodian Catholic priests. The Catholic Church had been there for a long time, thanks to French missionaries, but he was one of the first 3 native priests. And he was the first native Cambodian bishop. This happens in 1975. Father Salas is studying in France when Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge took power in Cambodia. Now, the bishop in Cambodia at this time was French-born, and he knew that all foreigners like himself were going to be deported, kicked out of the country. So he writes to Father Salas in Paris and says, I want you to come home and take my place as the bishop so that the church's leadership here will no longer be foreign. Salas agrees. As he departs France, he expresses to a friend that he knew returning home meant he would probably die. He was willfully taking up that cross. By the way, I didn't say something similar about Bonhoeffer. He went to England, planned to wait out the war there, and said, no, I have to go home and be with my fellow suffering Germans, even if it means I will die. So Father Salas shares that with Bonhoeffer. The Khmer Rouge did indeed expel all foreigners, including that French bishop. But not only that, Pol Pot bans all religion. Salas remains present anyway, and he continues to minister to Christians anyway. Pastoral care, baptism, secret masses in a small hut for his fellow Catholics. Perhaps the regular work of the church, nothing special, at least nothing out of the ordinary, but work banned by a dictator for its essential role in giving hope to the people. Ultimately, Bishop Salas volunteered for a hard labor camp. His goal was to meet other scattered Christians so that he might love and minister to them. He died in that camp, of hunger and exhaustion. We don't know anything about his death other than finding his body and doing the autopsy and knowing it was hunger and exhaustion. He was 39 years old, my age, one of 2 million people killed by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Like St. Colby in Auschwitz, Bishop Salas's resistance wasn't a prophetic voice, as we usually think of that term. It was merely sacramental worship and pastoral presence for those who needed it, right when it was forbidden. Colby and Salas's presence ensured Christ's church remained as a beacon of piety, love, and hope, even when their government said it could not. Just as the resurrected, incarnate Christ and his love also remain at all times, in all places, no matter how dark. Those are the biographies. That brings us to the final section of God's microphones. A microphone amplifies something. God's microphones amplify Christ right when the world's leaders most oppose love. Amplifying Christ can mean amplifying Christ's opposition to injustice, his flipped tables, his mother's speech about tearing down the mighty. It can mean amplifying his presence for those on the margins, holding the poor, the hungry, the jailed, the sick, the migrant, the disabled, the LGBT community, undocumented immigrants, holding them close when the state would turn them into scapegoats. It can mean calling others to do the same. It can mean amplifying baptism and Eucharist for all, when and where grace is most unwelcome. That diversity of approach is reflected in the microphones we've looked at today. And yet, while they are diverse, there are also patterns. So I want to name 6 themes I see uniting these stories, and perhaps those themes can reverberate into our own world and lives today. Number 1, they used the platforms they had, whether big or small. Whatever was available to them. They didn't say, I'm too small, I've got nothing. They didn't say, oh, I must protect what I have. Ambrose used his relationship with emperors to set those emperors straight. Romero did not shy away from using the country's biggest radio program. Bonhoeffer did not stop teaching or publishing when ordered to do so. And the same is true of ordinary people and local pastors with less reach. The White Rose got themselves a copy machine, called a duplicating machine, and they did what they knew how. They simply wrote. I talked about the social worker, Miriam Hapig, very briefly, just looking at her surroundings, seeing her access to a hospital, her access to a prison. Others saw their access to an office and did what they could to slow up the clerical work. They just did what they could at work, whatever work happened to be. St. Colby and Bishop Salas celebrating communion as long as bread was available. Number 2, many of these saints that we've looked at resisted blasphemy. They opposed the corruption of their faith by the empire. Ambrose of Milan, one of the chief opponents of history's most famous Christian heresy, Arianism. Harriet Tubman, challenging slave owner theology. Oscar Romero, not only critiquing the government for its death squads and assaults on the poor, but also critiquing his own pope and his fellow El Salvadorian bishops for not taking action and demanding that they speak out. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, not only opposing the Reichskirch's twisted theological justifications for nationalism, but also opposing his own confessing church's anti-Semitism, saying time and time again, you've got Jesus wrong. The White Rose, pointing out the places where Hitler committed blasphemy by invoking God for his evil war and genocide. They didn't just say, this isn't what Jesus wants. They said, you're misusing Jesus. For the most part, I'm just trying to share the relevant history and letting you connect the dots. But for the bias of my own background, on this one point, I do want to draw the explicit parallel to our own times and point out the need not just to stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also the need to explicitly challenge the white Christian nationalism that is done in Jesus's name, that is done in our name as Christians, a twisted theology that undergirds so much public policy. Number 3, the third of the 6 themes I see. These saints spoke prophetic truth to political power, formed not by their country's laws, but by God's tradition of biblical prophets speaking out to kings. This is an obvious one. They spoke out, but they spoke out from the Bible. Just worth naming. Number 4, they loved the poor, and not abstractly, not from afar, not just with their dollars, but with their time. They spent time with the poor. Some of them were the poor. They recognized that we are all equal in God's eyes. And that starts with poverty, but it expands out to other marginalized populations, as Bonhoeffer experienced in the Black church. And they saw firsthand how their governments preserved power by keeping people in poverty, God's people. For those in prominent positions, their demonstrated love for the poor also helped build trust and popularity with the public, Ambrose and Romero. And that gave them a political weight of their own that politicians had to reckon with. Starts with loving the poor. Number 5, they spoke out and showed up for others when the state told them they couldn't. The key word here is speaking out for others. They loved their neighbors as they loved themselves. Everyone has flaws, and one common flaw in history is to speak out only for your own people. Like I said, we saw that today. Well, we saw it in Ambrose, right? He was guarding the church and he was anti-Semitic. We also saw it in the vaunted confessing church. And I said we would touch on Martin Niemöller's poem, First They Came. It's not an abstract poem. The German theologian, the Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller wrote, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." It's not just a poem or a prayer, it's an autobiography. Niemöller was a Lutheran pastor and a confessing church member who was arrested for challenging Hitler's Führer principle and takeover of the church, but he was also a self-described anti-Semite. He realized the error of his ways in the concentration camp. Thankfully, he spent his life atoning. That's a beautiful thing. We focus on the atonement, on the people who are at the end. We all have our sins. But the mistake that Niemöller and others made, Bonhoeffer didn't make. Bonhoeffer spoke out against anti-Semitism. And Romero did not wait to engage the government until his fellow priests were killed, as the people teach. He began doing so as soon as he saw the death squads. Now, most resistance does begin with the oppressed themselves speaking out for their own freedom. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, the civil rights movement was led by Black Americans and Black churches, as was necessary. But as the movement gained concrete victories, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew he needed to support others in peril. As he wrote in the letter from Birmingham jail, "Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so his work grew beyond the civil rights movement, but also to poverty and to peace. God's most effective microphones speak out not just for their people, though that may come first, but ultimately for all people under the yoke of oppression. Finally, and most importantly, these figures each had the strength to persevere and to sacrifice because they each had a deep, incredibly strong, pre-existing faith. In some ways, that's not surprising. After all, we're looking at a list of Christians who put faith into action. Having faith is kind of a prerequisite to being on this list. But it's important to note that their faith was not grounded in social justice or resistance or in freedom. Rather, their views on justice, resistance, and freedom sprang from their faith. Faith comes first. Jesus must come first, for everything flows from him. Colossians, all things were created in and for Christ. All things hold together in Christ. God reconciles all things in Christ. In 2023, 3 years ago, I was really lucky. I had a private tour of the Bonhoeffer house in Berlin, where he was arrested. The curator was infuriated by the way some in the American evangelical right have misused Bonhoeffer to justify election denial and assaults on human rights. At the same time, he actually also found it troubling when anyone, right or left, tries to use Bonhoeffer for a preset agenda, and that includes social justice progressives. That they understood Bonhoeffer, but were still not quite using him correctly. He said to me, Bonhoeffer should not be used for any cause. Instead, look at Bonhoeffer's own focus as a starting point, the identity and divinity of Jesus Christ. That will lead you to care for the lives of others in your own social context, just as it did Bonhoeffer in his. We're not starting with the social context. We're not starting with others. We're starting with the divinity and identity and love of Jesus Christ. That's what everyone on our list did. They started with the gospel. And they didn't just start with it. They bathed in it. For all of them, faith wasn't something nebulous in the cultural background. It was a deep, well-informed, practical Christian spirituality, always with a long history of prayer and formation. Harriet Tubman leaned on the stories of Moses. St. Ambrose, one of history's most original theologians and a writer of poignant hymns. The White Rose students, cultivating rich interior prayer lives, inspired by the works of saints. The prophetic voice does not materialize only when authoritarianism and tyranny arrive. Like a tree that takes years to grow deep roots before it can withstand a hurricane, the prophetic voice is forged for years ahead of time in the refiner's fire of scripture, sacrament, and community. I didn't even think about this till now. It's today's gospel. The prophetic voice lands in the deep soil to grow deep roots before we see the tree. If those of us concerned with the threat of contemporary authoritarianism and tyranny and fascism are not already taking active steps to let God form and refine our own interior strength, our prayer life, our solidarity and time with the poor, our spiritual knowledge, and our hunger for Jesus, then it's past time we get started. Thank you. So I know it's 11:56. I know I'm standing between you and proper lunch. If you need to leave, my feelings are not hurt, but I am happy if you are to spend another 15 or 20 minutes and take questions or hear comments. So can I see a bunch of hands, and I'll try and call on some folks. All right, first hand, only hand up.
You're young enough, but I imagine 25 years from now, you may be giving a similar lecture. Who will you point to in the year 2026 as part of your lecture?
From today?
Yes.
I know some of the people, so this is being recorded, so I don't want to play favorites. I'm not going to name names, but I will say this. Look to the Black church. Look to the Black church. Those folks have been leading the way for decades, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly. I don't know if he's on this list. I just mainly know him as a preacher. Otis Moss III in Chicago is my favorite preacher to watch and learn from, and teaching about liberation theology and Black liberation theology. But that's more an example of look at these great sermons. There are many other names. You know, the question:
who's in prison? Who's died?
Mm-hmm. So we'll see what. Well, I mean, yes. If you're thinking of the faith of. Oh, can't believe I'm blanking on her name. The first of the activists shot in Minneapolis.
Good.
Renee Good. Renee Good. Yeah, Renee Good died. And she was doing what she did because of her Presbyterian faith. I hope we don't see more stories like this. We might. It really depends on how these next few years pan out, how bad it gets. What are the opportunities for people? We can start looking and see who we think has that faith formed, who's forming it. You know, already speak. I'll say one name who's I did not talk about any Episcopalians or Anglicans, because usually in the countries where Anglicanism is most strong, that's not where we've seen these forms of fascism pan out. Why? It's the English going forth, their colonialism. But look at what Bishop Mary Ann Bunny did.
Yes.
You know, in her sermon, but even before her sermon at the cathedral, you remember when he held up the Bible, tear gassed the protesters to hold up the Bible for his photo op at a church that's actually got some problematic Christian nationalism of its own inside. That's neither here nor there. Bishop Mary Ann was all over the news speaking out against the misuse of an Episcopal church during the first term. Like some of these characters, Bishop Mary Ann had her own faith journey. My predecessor at Faithful America was pushing her hard in January 2017 to not host the typical inaugural hoopla at the National Cathedral, the honorary choral concert and big prayer service where the president-elect gets to pick the preacher and all that stuff. She held all that tradition for him anyway in January 2017, not in January 2025 for the second term. So Bishop Mary Ann is definitely leading the way. And Sylvie, do you remember the nice bishop who made you a peanut butter sandwich in her living room? No, you were a little too young to remember that? She is the kindest, sweetest person. Got to go to her house after a conference. And
Friends with our former senior board.
oh, fantastic. I'm not surprised. So within Episcopal context, I mean, what she's done wouldn't be enough to put her on this list, but let's see what keeps happening. And again, look to the Black church, look to the churches on the margins. Follow them. Other questions, historical questions? Yes.
Yes, I want to congratulate you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
First. Second, I'm glad you included the two figures on the back of the page, because I think it makes an important point that people don't have to have written things that have been published to be important, and we need to recognize them too, and I congratulate you for that. One of the things you said about the two of them, I also discovered was true of Bonhoeffer in some of my studies, and that is that after he was arrested, at least for me, one of the things that was most powerful about the end of his life before he was killed was that he very much served as a pastor to his fellow inmates. Oh, and that to me was a very touching thing. And the last thing is I just want to point out, in case you didn't know it, it only takes one doctorate to be a college, university, or a seminary professor. So just maybe plant a seed.
Take that seat, throw it to somebody else. Demon, I think about a demon sometimes, but that's for practical theology out in the field. I hadn't heard that about Bonhoeffer in prison, but I had heard that. Doesn't surprise me. Here's somebody else, not the most pastoral, but becomes a youth pastor and becomes more and more pastoral through his career. And I have heard that when the Gestapo closed Finkenwald, his confessing church seminary, it went underground. He wasn't at that point just that he'd always been a stern teacher, but his students took to calling him Pastor Bonhoeffer. I've not met any of those students, but I've met people who have, and they all talk about how the students just remember how warm and pastoral their professor was to them in those dark moments. And since you mentioned these figures on the last page, to the point of looking to the Black church and the church on the margins, I'd not heard of Bishop Salas, but I noticed I'm over-reliant, with the exception of Romero. William Romero's the Americas. I'm only looking at the Americas in Europe, and that might be my own bias. And Romero is Latin American, and Harriet Tubman is Black, but otherwise these figures being American and European or white. So I said, well, where are the other dictators? And, the church isn't huge in Cambodia, so you're not finding a lot of resistant names. But I started trying to look at these other places, Uganda, Cambodia, and you do find names like Bishop Joseph there, who we need to learn about and follow, and be sure for their own sake are remembered and honored in their death as well as their life. Anyone else?
Oh, another man I mentioned is Father Puglisi in Palermo. So I don't know. But anyway, he basically resisted another authoritarian organization called Marthas.
Oh.
And he's an amazing person. He basically tried to teach people in his community there's another way of living besides going up with the Marthas. The Marthas totally wanted to stop doing it, and he continued doing it. And when the Mafia came to his door to assassinate him, he opened the door and said, I've been waiting for him. So he But everything you said, there's a different source, it's not a state fund, but the mafia. And that in fact was the catalyst behind the two attorneys. Well, that was the beginning of the attack on against the mafia in Sicily. You know, the assassination of she's canonized in this church.
Actually, my current binge watch is The Sopranos. So a priest in Palermo stood against the mafia. I focused on states and governments, maybe for obvious headline reasons, but the mafia is kind of the government in some places, or controls it. It's certainly in some points in time. So like Tubman challenging our perception of totalitarianism. I appreciate that.
And we please give Reverend Nathan another hand. Please also give a hand to someone who receives my panicked texts as the result of my poor planning late in the game and say, is there any way you can record this? Please give Sharon a hand. She's also with our other AV folks hidden behind that screen, and I don't thank her and them enough. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.